raise your hand if you have never been shocked by the freewheeling moors of ancient Rome. The culture of the people of that time was indeed very different from what we're accustomed to today. This is especially true of Roman sexuality. But was it so different from ours? Did they really live in conditions of total sexual freedom? What was going on back then? Let's try to understand. The ancient Romans' understanding of sexuality is rooted in religious and cultic rituals. At that time, people were mainly engaged in agriculture, so the fertility deities had a special meaning for them. This also affected family life. One of the most important of these was Mutuntutun, who was depicted with hypertrophied male genitals. This was a symbol of both the fertility of the land and procreation. Not surprisingly, rituals involving Mutuntun were sexual in nature. For example, brides would come to him on their first wedding night to relinquish their innocence and at the same time seek the help of higher powers in their married life. In addition to Mutuntutun, other deities in the Roman pantheon were directly associated with sexuality. For example, the feminine was personified by the goddess Juno and the masculine by the god Genius. There was also Janus, the god of beginnings. He opened the way for the seed to conceive. This relationship was characteristic of many ancient cultures, but the Roman one was distinguished by the most progressive idea of sexuality and eroticism. However, it was not without influence from other countries. Numerous contacts with other peoples brought the Romans many new ideas, not only about the divine. First of all, ancient Greece left its mark. The developed Greek culture was rich in deities, closely connected with the perception of love, and was famous for singing the male and female body. As a result of Greek influence in the life of the Romans appeared Venus, the goddess of love, as well as the deities Priapus and Liber. Venus in Rome acquired her own peculiarities. She was considered the mother of the Roman people. Priapus, as well as Mutuntutun, was the deity of fertility, childbearing assistant in case of sexual disorders. The worship of Priapus was expressed in festivals, which, according to some ancient authors, were extremely lewd. The cult of Libera was also accompanied by festivals, mystical bacchanalia. One form was held in strict secrecy with wine drinking, orgies, and sacrifices. Greece brought to the life of the Romans fine art sculpture, where without any embarrassment demonstrated sensual images of women and men. It was not only Greece that influenced Rome. Deities such as Isis and Cybele associated with sexual practices were borrowed from Asia. It is generally believed that it was the intertwining of many outside cults with local mores that determined the uniqueness of Roman perceptions of sexuality. Sexual permissiveness seemed to reign throughout the Roman Republic and Empire. But how much could the Romans really afford? From the founding of Rome to the beginning of the crisis of the Roman Republic, society followed a fairly standardized way of life. The foundation was patriarchy. Men embodied courage and virtue, women modesty and fidelity. At the same time, the role of women remained quite significant with the development of statehood. Relationships between couples began to be regulated not only from a religious point of view, but also from a political one. It was believed that procreation ensured the well-being and prosperity of the state. Sex was not, in principle, something shameful, and the limits of what was allowed were much wider than those that existed in later Christian states. This seems to be freedom. However, there were unspoken laws in Roman society. Citizens who did not know the measure were actively censored. The inability to control one's desires was perceived as a weakness and therefore excluded such a man from participating in public affairs and being a worthy representative of civil society. Thus, the frequency of sexual contact played an important role. The perception of nudity was also contradictory. Unlike the Greeks, nudity became a disgrace for a worthy Roman. This was even reflected in the professions. For example, gladiators or actors. In both cases, they were people of low social status. This is because gladiators were mostly recruited from slaves, and actors used their bodies and played other people's roles. They were considered untrustworthy. It was this status that allowed them to be naked, but a clothed body was considered sexy. There is no getting around the legal side of the issue. The human body was protected by the law. During the Roman Republic, corporal punishment and sexual violence were forbidden, and violators were severely punished. And what about women? If a man was formally allowed to have extramarital affairs, a woman was required to remain faithful to her husband. At the same time, in the Republican period, the state did not interfere in family affairs. The family solved such problems on its own. It was only at the beginning of the empire, under Octavian Augustus, that the state began to consider family life as a sphere of its interest. There were fines or some symbolic punishments for wives and lovers. The political crisis of the Republic, which led to civil wars, changed the life of Rome. During this period, ancient authors spoke more and more often about the promiscuity and spiritual ugliness of society. The end of the crisis was marked by the beginning of a new stage of Roman history, the Age of Empire. However, according to contemporaries, wickedness did not disappear anywhere. Historians and thinkers devoted more and more works to the alleviation of vices. They paid special attention to the intimate side of the lives of Roman emperors and members of their families. The most striking figure was Emperor Caligula, who ruled from 37 to 41 AD. He was described as an extremely cruel and ruthless man who tended to enjoy executions and torture. Caligula was accused of not missing a single woman or man, even having affairs with his siblings. By the way, in contrast to the earlier period, female sexuality also began to become more vivid during the Roman Empire. This is not surprising. The crisis only caused a change in the previous order. Rome was no longer a state for men. Women gained more and more rights and freedoms. They became bolder in their sexual desires and needs, independent of their husbands. Before Caligula, the public vehemently condemned Emperor Octavian's daughter, Julia the Elder, who was famous for her numerous love affairs and unprincipled behavior. In general, there was no ruler or his relatives whose sexual preferences were not described and criticized by ancient authors. This shaped the promiscuous image of the Roman state. In the future, Christian authors denounced the licentiousness of manners. They considered Rome to be wild and obscene. This opinion has to some extent survived to modern perceptions and is often exploited in popular culture. However, the lifestyles and moras of the elite do not represent the moras of the rest of society, whose sexual life at that time was inadequately described. In addition, many authors represented the interests and opposition of the imperial power, which often deliberately distorted the facts. Later, the Roman authorities themselves began to change their attitudes and to side with the condemned. In the 3rd century, the Roman Empire began to actively spread Christianity, which strictly regulated sexual relations. Roman Emperor Philip I Arab, who ruled from 244 to 249, was a follower of Christian ideals, so he introduced a ban on male prostitution. And in the 4th century, when Christianity was recognized as an official religion under Emperor Constantine I, men began to be persecuted for homosexuality. The unchastity and fidelity of women then again became an example to be followed. Roman sexual life is indeed an interesting and uncertain phenomenon. After the fall of the Roman Empire, Christian authors attributed the fall of the great state precisely to sexual degradation, and the entertaining stories of ancient authors continued to reinforce the impression of ancient Rome as a center of debauchery. But the concept of sexuality was controversial at the time, and all other aspects of life in the Roman state should not be over. Therefore, it is not possible today to make a clear assessment of the Mori and the reasons for the collapse. The fall of ancient civilization was preceded by the Great Migration of peoples, the restoration of paganism, and a host of other events. Thanks for watching. If you liked this episode, give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe and share with friends.